My name is Eleanor Price, and I was 34 years old when the custody case began. At that point in my life, I believed I understood stability. My days were structured around school mornings, packed lunches, and the quiet routines that form when a child trusts you completely. My son and I lived in a small, orderly apartment where nothing dramatic ever happened, and I mistook that absence of chaos for security. Before lawyers and court dates entered my vocabulary, motherhood felt straightforward. I worked, I showed up, I listened. I believed consistency mattered more than perfection, and I assumed that effort naturally translated into safety. There was comfort in thinking love was measurable through sacrifice and time. I never imagined those things would need to be proven to strangers. My son was observant and gentle, the kind of child who noticed shifts in tone before words changed. Our bond wasn't loud or performative. It existed in shared glances, quiet jokes, and the way he reached for my hand without thinking. I assumed that kind of connection spoke for itself. At the time, I still believed systems were designed to recognize truth. I trusted that calm people were taken seriously, that history mattered, and that showing up consistently would be enough. I didn't yet understand how easily personal reality can be flattened into paperwork. Looking back, the warning signs were subtle. Conversations became careful. Assumptions replaced explanations. Nothing had broken yet, but something had begun to loosen, quietly, without my permission. I was still standing on solid ground, unaware it was already shifting beneath me, and I carried on as if tomorrow would resemble yesterday. That belief, gentle and unguarded, would soon be tested by decisions made far outside my voice. At that moment, I had no reason to resist. Nothing about the beginning felt dramatic. It started with forms, emails, and conversations that sounded neutral but carried weight I couldn't name. Words like jurisdiction, precedent, and evaluation replaced questions about routines or feelings. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, papers spread out, realizing how quickly lived experience could be reduced to checkboxes. The lawyers spoke calmly, almost kindly, which made it harder to push back. Their tones suggested fairness, yet every sentence reminded me that the system spoke its own language, and I was not fluent. I answered questions carefully, choosing words the way someone handles fragile glass, aware that anything misshaped could be used later. There was no anger in the room, just procedure, and somehow that felt worse. What unsettled me most was how invisible I began to feel. My history as a mother was treated as background noise, while timelines and technicalities took center stage. I noticed how often I was interrupted, not rudely, but efficiently. Efficiency became the excuse for emotional absence. No one asked how my son was sleeping. They asked about schedules. I started adjusting myself without realizing it. I softened statements, added qualifiers, explained things that had never needed explanation before. Each meeting ended with polite smiles and unresolved tension. I would walk back to my car feeling as though I had misplaced something essential, though I couldn't say what. Over time, the imbalance became internal. I replayed conversations, wondering if I sounded unreliable, too emotional, or not emotional enough. The language of the process seeped into my thinking, and I began evaluating myself the way the paperwork did. I told myself this was normal, that systems needed structure. Still, a quiet unease followed me home each time. By the time the dispute had a name, something had already shifted. I no longer assumed my role spoke for itself. I felt the first erosion of confidence, slow and almost polite, and I didn't yet know how deeply it would reach. That early uncertainty lingered quietly, settling into my thoughts, preparing the ground for doubts I would soon struggle to silence entirely. Self-doubt didn't arrive all at once. It settled in during the quiet hours, when the apartment was dark and my son was asleep, and my mind replayed every conversation in fragments. I began wondering if I had said too much or not enough, if my calm sounded like indifference, or if any trace of emotion would be used against me. The questions looped without resolution. I started measuring myself against an invisible standard. Was I credible enough, composed enough, maternal in the right way? I reread emails, searching for mistakes, tone issues, anything that could be misinterpreted. At night, I rehearsed explanations no one had asked for yet, shaping sentences in my head as if clarity alone could protect us. Sleep became shallow. I would wake before dawn with a tightness in my chest, already tired of defending a version of myself that felt increasingly distant. The system valued documentation, not intuition. Patterns mattered more than presence. I understood that intellectually, but emotionally, it felt like being asked to translate love into a language stripped of nuance. I blamed myself quietly. Maybe I should have anticipated this. Maybe consistency wasn't enough. Maybe there was a rule everyone else knew and I had somehow missed. I didn't share these thoughts with anyone. They felt private, almost shameful, as if doubt itself were a weakness that might confirm what I feared others already believed. Still, I showed up. I organized folders, complied with requests, answered questions precisely. Outwardly, I appeared steady. Internally, I was negotiating with uncertainty, trying to hold on to my sense of self while adapting to a framework that seemed designed to flatten it. Each step forward carried the awareness that the stakes were no longer theoretical. The possibility of losing daily proximity to my child moved from abstract fear to tangible threat. That realization changed the weight of everything. It sharpened my attention, narrowed my focus, and pressed against me constantly. I was no longer just explaining my life. I was defending it, piece by piece, hoping that somewhere inside the process, my truth would still be recognizable. I felt time compress, choices narrowing, consequences approaching with a clarity that erased distraction. Every decision carried weight, every pause felt risky. The margin for error thinned, and I sensed the story moving beyond explanation towards something irreversible, demanding I couldn't predict. Waiting became its own form of discipline. Between court dates, time stretched in a way I hadn't experienced before, thick and unresponsive. There were weeks where nothing happened outwardly, yet everything inside me felt suspended. No calls, no updates, no indication of how things were leaning. Silence filled the space where reassurance might have been, and I learned quickly that silence was not neutral. Each morning, I moved through routine on autopilot: breakfast, school drop-off, work, dinner. On the surface, life continued. Internally, my attention was split, one part present, the other permanently braced. I checked my phone more than I wanted to admit, not expecting news, but unable to stop hoping for clarity. Nothing came. The court operated with emotional distance that felt deliberate. Deadlines arrived without explanation. Instructions were brief, impersonal. I was told to wait, to be patient, to trust the process. Trust became an abstract concept when there was no feedback loop, no indication that anyone was truly listening. I began to understand how withholding information could quietly establish control. At night, my thoughts grew louder. I replayed worst-case scenarios in detail, then criticized myself for doing so. I wondered how judges made decisions when they didn't see the hours that shaped a relationship. I imagined my son navigating changes he hadn't chosen, and the thought tightened something in me I couldn't release. Silence left too much room for imagination. What struck me most was how composed everyone else appeared. In hearings, faces remained neutral, voices even. My internal urgency had no visible counterpart. That contrast made me feel exposed, as though caring deeply was a liability. I learned to contain my expressions, to answer without emphasis, to keep my voice level, even when my body resisted. The waiting demanded restraint. I couldn't argue with absence or respond to what wasn't said. I was forced into stillness while consequences gathered momentum elsewhere. Over time, the pressure stopped feeling sharp and became dense, constant. It followed me into conversations, meals, sleep. Just when the quiet felt unbearable, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to register. A request, unexpected and specific, arrived without context. It was the first interruption in the silence, and it carried the sense that whatever came next would not be passive. The pause was ending, and I felt the weight of that transition settle in. I didn't know what it would lead to, only that the waiting phase was over. The silence had done its work, stripping me down to awareness. I felt alert, contained, and strangely steady. Whatever followed would require presence, not panic. I took note of that feeling, the way pressure can either fracture you or sharpen you, and I understood that something important was about to be revealed, not through argument, but through a moment I hadn't anticipated yet. It hovered just ahead, unresolved, carrying consequences I sensed but couldn't define, pulling me forward with a quiet certainty that resistance was no longer an option for me. Steadiness I wasn't sure I fully possessed yet, then there, feel like space. I became more observant. I noticed how often my son paused before answering questions from adults, how carefully he chose words. He was aware of the tension without being consumed by it. Watching him, I felt both protective and respectful. His experience belonged to him, not to the process unfolding around us. I realized that clarity doesn't demand volume, it asks for alignment. For the first time, I stopped anticipating counter-arguments and started listening instead. I listened to what my son said casually, what he avoided, what comforted him. There was nothing rehearsed in those moments, just consistency. The idea emerged slowly, not as a strategy, not as a move, simply as a recognition that his voice mattered in its original form, not filtered through testimony or interpretation. I didn't suggest it at first. I waited, letting the thoughts settle without pressure. When the possibility came up naturally, I framed it carefully. No expectations, no instructions. I told him that if he wanted to speak, he could, that there was no right or wrong way, and no obligation. His response was thoughtful, unhurried. He asked questions that showed awareness beyond his age, and I answered honestly. Preparing for that moment required restraint. I resisted the urge to guide or correct. This wasn't about outcome, it was about integrity. Allowing space felt like trust, and trust felt like the only form of power I was willing to claim. As the date approached, I felt composed in a way I hadn't before, not confident, not relieved, but aligned. Whatever followed would unfold without manipulation. The shift had already happened inside me. I was no longer reacting. I was present, grounded in the understanding that truth, when allowed to exist without interference, carries its own weight. That realization didn't eliminate fear, but it softened it, replacing urgency with resolve and setting the stage for what would soon be heard. It felt important to remain still, to not rush toward meaning or outcome. I understood that whatever was coming would carry weight precisely because it wasn't forced. This was not about being believed more, but about being seen clearly. I allowed myself to breathe inside that space, holding onto calm rather than certainty. The next step hadn't happened yet, but the ground beneath me felt steadier than it had in months. I trusted that presence, once established, could speak without effort, and I was ready to let that happen when the moment arrived, without defense, without preparation beyond honesty, knowing that this pause was not empty. Preparation didn't look like rehearsing lines or correcting tone. It looked like stepping back. When the idea of the video settled between us, I made a deliberate choice to do less, not more. I showed him how it worked and then left the room. That was the extent of my involvement. I didn't ask what he planned to say. I didn't suggest topics or remind him of details. I told him only that his words belonged to him and that there was no expectation attached to them. If he changed his mind, we would stop. That condition mattered more than the message itself. Over the next few days, I noticed how carefully he approached it. He would think quietly, sometimes staring out the window, sometimes retreating to his room. There was no urgency in him, no performative seriousness. He carried it the way children carry truths when they feel respected. I felt the pull to intervene more than once. Old habits surfaced, the instinct to protect by shaping outcomes. Each time, I reminded myself that control would contaminate what needed to remain clean. Trust required tolerance for uncertainty, and I practiced that restraint intentionally. When he finally recorded the message, it happened without ceremony. He asked me to press record, then asked me to leave again. I sat on the other side of the door, listening to nothing, resisting the urge to fill the silence with reassurance. Whatever he said was his. Afterward, he handed me the device without explanation. I didn't watch it immediately. I waited until he was asleep, then waited longer. I wanted distance, not influence. When I did watch, I focused on his steadiness rather than the content. His voice wasn't dramatic, it was clear. I didn't edit the video, I didn't trim pauses or adjust lighting. Imperfection felt appropriate. Anything polished would misrepresent the truth of it. This wasn't evidence crafted to persuade, it was presence, unfiltered. As the court date approached, I felt composed in a way that surprised me. I wasn't bracing for impact or preparing arguments. I had already done what mattered. The preparation was internal, a commitment to stay out of the way. Walking into the courthouse with the video in my bag, I felt the weight of responsibility without panic. I wasn't carrying leverage, I was carrying honesty. That distinction mattered. Whatever unfolded next would not depend on how convincingly I spoke, but on what had already been said, quietly, in his own time. I understood then that the moment ahead would not belong to me, and I was ready to let it happen. I trusted that restraint had preserved something essential. Silence had allowed meaning to form without pressure. As I took my seat, I reminded myself that outcomes were no longer mine to control. I could remain present, attentive, and still. The room felt neutral, almost indifferent, and that neutrality no longer frightened me. I had learned that quiet spaces can carry weight. The waiting was over, and what followed would move forward without urgency. I allowed the moment to arrive on its own terms, knowing that whatever response emerged would belong to the truth already spoken, not to my effort or interpretation. I sat still, aware that consequence had begun to unfold. When the video was introduced, the room changed without announcement. A small screen was positioned, and I kept my eyes forward, not on it, but on the people who had authority in that space. I wasn't interested in watching my son again. I wanted to see what happened around his words. His voice filled the room evenly. No tremor, no performance. I noticed the judge stop writing. A pen hovered, then rested. One attorney shifted back in their chair, crossing their arms more slowly than before. These were minor movements, almost unremarkable, yet they registered with clarity. I stayed still. I focused on breathing, on the weight of my hands in my lap. I didn't look for approval or reaction from anyone connected to me. The video wasn't meant to speak for me. It stood on its own, and I let it. There were pauses in his speech that weren't edited out. The silence between sentences seemed to stretch, and no one rushed to fill it. For the first time in months, the room wasn't operating on efficiency. It was listening. When the video ended, there was no immediate response, no acknowledgement. That absence carried more weight than commentary would have. The judge looked down, then up again, slower this time. I noticed a subtle softening around the eyes, not emotional, but attentive. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel vindicated. What I felt was distance. The urgency that had followed me into every interaction loosened its grip. I realized that whatever assumptions had existed before were now interrupted. The power in the room shifted quietly. No one named it. No one needed to. The atmosphere felt altered, as if something previously unseen had become present without explanation. I understood then that impact doesn't require emphasis. It happens when truth is allowed to arrive intact. I remained composed, aware that nothing needed to be said next. As the hearing moved forward, questions took on a different tone, more measured, less procedural. I answered simply, without adding context or defense. The room no longer felt adversarial, just observant. When we stood to leave, the silence followed us. It wasn't heavy, it was deliberate. I sensed that something irreversible had occurred, not in outcome, but in orientation. The narrative had widened, and I knew the aftermath would unfold slowly, beyond that room, in ways I didn't yet need to understand. That awareness settled quietly inside me, without instruction. I didn't analyze it or assign meaning. I simply noticed the absence of tension in my body. The moment had passed, but its effect lingered, steady and unresolved, pointing forward rather than demanding reaction. It remained with me as we exited the courtroom together.